Today we're thinking about vaccines, and I wanted just to start by saying why this topic. Why might vaccination be an interesting lens to look through if we want to think about health and development more broadly? We're talking here about a big key global health issue. Vaccination is a big policy priority in many countries and globally. It's the source of a great deal of investment by private sector companies. It's the source of a lot of scientific research. But it also, I think, is quite good to think with. And certainly in the work I did around vaccination a few years ago, subsequently, I've gone on finding it a very powerful window to think about some broader themes that are critically important in health and public health, and actually in development generally. One is to think about public health and what public health policy is about, and about the relationship between the health of individuals and bodies and that more public sense of protecting populations and communities. It's also a useful lens for thinking about technologies in health, about new technologies, old technologies, and about some of the challenges and issues that arise in delivering those technologies, not just from a technical standpoint or not just from a supply standpoint, but also about the social context and particularly the political dimensions which often surround people's understandings of and willingness to engage with and accept or perhaps feel worried about technologies of different kinds. And so thirdly, vaccination has been the subject of quite a lot of controversies over recent years, but actually controversies around vaccination have haunted vaccination since the very, very beginning. So it's quite a useful lens to think about controversies in health and actually controversies in science and policy more generally. I'm going to begin by kind of running through a brief history of vaccination in its policy context and approaches that have been taken. And then the second half really looks at vaccination uptake and questions about demand and when demand happens and when people refuse vaccinations and why they do. And I'll set out some possible frameworks and then illustrate some of those through a case study from the Gambia. Why is vaccination interesting? What are some of the big claims and characteristics that surround this? Well, first of all, it's claimed to be one of the two most effective public health interventions that there have ever been, okay? And the other being clean water. It's also claimed to be the most cost-effective public health intervention in terms of straight cost-benefit, in terms of mortality and morbidity reductions ever. It's also, I think, interesting because it's so incredibly universal. If you think about it, we were all probably as babies vaccinated, or if we weren't, it was expected that we would be. And there are probably some quite interesting reasons why we weren't, which we could explore. But there's an expectation that vaccination is something that is done to every baby, every child, everywhere. And then, of course, there are other vaccinations that are available to people later in life. And I think this kind of universalism, and indeed the sort of universalism in the expectations of the technology and how it's rolled out, is actually quite rare and quite unique. There are very few other technologies which have that quality of being expected to be so universal. Of course, despite that universalism, there are quite a lot of variations too. There are different vaccinations for different diseases, which work in slightly different ways. There are variants in the basic ways that vaccines work. Some of the essential differences that you've got kind of live vaccines where it's actually almost a small part of the disease, an antigen from the disease which induces an immune response in the body. You've also got what are sometimes called dead vaccines, where the vaccination involves an introduction of the antibodies directly. And then there are new generations of vaccines which work through DNA in various ways. There are also some different forms of delivery. There are vaccines that are injected, there are others that are oral, like the polio vaccine. There are others, quite interesting generation of vaccines that almost overlap with foods and plant-based vaccines, and interesting, quite cutting-edge research around genetically modifying plants to include vaccines within them. But those, as it were, variants on the technology side. I think what's also critical is that these technologies come to mean very different things as they are applied and delivered in different worlds and locations and places and societies and communities and cultural settings that are extremely different. Let's take a very brief run through a history of vaccination. Now, this is only one history. There are many histories one could tell. And this is a particular one that I think comes across quite nicely through a look at some of the campaigns that have emerged around vaccination from some of its earliest days. And a few years ago, the World Health Organization published a lovely big glossy coffee table book around the history of public health campaigns. It was part of their 50th anniversary, and they took up a number of different topics. HIV was one, sexual health was another, and vaccination was one of them. And the posters are very telling about these different eras on what was expected of vaccination at different points. But the origins precede the posters, and for many, those origins are traced to the UK and to a country doctor called Edward Jenner in 1796. And this is a kind of heroism story. What Jenner did at a time when smallpox was a rife disease that was killing people in the UK and around the world in a big way was discover through sort of experimentation in his own GP surgery that cowpox, which was a sort of milder disease that afflicted dairymaids often because it was linked with cattle, and had some similar qualities to smallpox. And by variolating, introducing a tiny little bit of the cowpox antigen into the arms and the bodies of some of these people who were in contact with smallpox, immunity against smallpox was created. So these experiments on the quiet in the dairy farms of rural England actually became then the basis of developing a smallpox vaccine in a sort of story of heroism. But what's quite interesting is that actually there's further medical history work which shows that this actually wasn't where the vaccination story all began, and that there were already indigenous techniques in various parts of the world, in particular in parts of Asia, with this idea of variolation, which is the introduction of a small bit of the disease into a body to induce immunity into the future. And that actually a different story about technology diffusion would see that vaccination was introduced into Europe from Asia via the Middle East much earlier in the 1700s, so before this kind of discovery by a UK doctor. And there's medical history work from parts of Africa as well, which shows that variolation was an established indigenous practice. But smallpox was certainly the beginning of the vaccination heroic story in Europe, and by the early 19th century, this vaccine had been produced, and there began to be campaigns to roll it out in European settings in a context where smallpox really was a very nasty and very bad disease. So all kinds of anxieties and rumours flew, and some of the writings about those early 19th century periods talk about how the poor of Victorian London, who were expected to be vaccinated against smallpox, saw this as a way of kind of repressing them and trying to keep them quiet and passive. What were vaccines really doing? Were they a way of kind of repressing the working classes? And people also had all kinds of worries about the link with cowpox, and actually would these vaccines turn them into sort of cow-like beings? It was about the idea of introducing something that was seen to have an animal origin into human bodies. But it still was rolled out, and smallpox began to decline over quite a long period. The next kind of heroism story really was the 1940s and 50s, at a time when polio, in a sort of endemic form, but also in epidemics, caused enormous worry and enormous maiming and disability. And it was the invention and then the rolling out of a polio vaccine in the 1950s, from 1955, that really began to be very successful and to reduce cases quite dramatically. So this is a poster from that period, which is actually encouraging people really for the first time to come forward. And this is an interesting poster because it plays on fear, and it plays on the idea of kind of doing things in time. And this is a family who hadn't been in time, as it were. And I think the implication is that this child has polio. But these were not only disease issues in the global north, and rather later in the day, the attack on smallpox and also on measles, which was a very serious infant killer in other parts of the world, and particularly in Africa. In the 1960s and 70s, just post-colonially, was the era when we saw the World Health Organization, and particularly the American Centers for Disease Control, launching a big internationally focused campaign to attack smallpox and measles and its huge effects, particularly on child health as well as adult health. And what's interesting is that this, unlike that kind of misery poster of the previous era, what we're seeing now is a fight. This use of kind of military metaphors, that here is a disease and immunisation, vaccination is part of almost the kind of weaponry, the armoury that the world now has against a disease. And these sort of military metaphors have continued in some areas of vaccination policy. And they became quite literal at this time, because in the late colonial period, much public health work in African contexts was very closely linked with often quite coercive military campaigns, which were about both using armies and organised military forces to deliver public health interventions, because they were organised and they were a force which one could kind of send out to sort of do things in rural areas. But there were also other kinds of links, even at this time, between public health and the control of population in other ways. And one only has to read some of the sort of histories of colonial medicine, and this was a kind of just post-colonial medicine, to understand the relationships between coercive public health and militarism even at that time. And, for instance, fears of disease were often used as pretext for moving populations out of areas where they weren't very convenient. Settlers in East Africa or the creation of national parks often required the movement of people who were inconveniently settled there. And often fears of disease and military campaigns to relocate people were part and parcel of those approaches. People like Megan Vaughan and Susan White have written very evocatively of these periods. And I think it's ironic that actually an attempt to deal with disease is also drawing both metaphorically and realistically on the use of often military coercion. By the early 80s, we began to see a period where, OK, you'd had some immunisation against certain diseases, often delivered in these rather campaign-like forms. So a big government force and military force would be acting on a particular disease and rolling out a vaccination programme. But this was obviously quite patchy in terms of where it worked and how much effect it had. So by the early 80s, immunisation coverage was very, very patchy around its diseases and around the places where it had been effective. And this was the time when the World Health Organization kind of took things in hand and launched what became known as the EPI, the Expanded Programme on Immunisation, which was an attempt to try and get universally the whole of the world's population in infancy immunised against a series of basic diseases. And those that were part of the package at that point were measles and polio, which we've talked about, and a range of others, diphtheria and tetanus and pertussis, which is whooping cough, which were combined in the DTP vaccine, and also BCG against tuberculosis. And so there was a kind of standard set of antigens, but also the other big change was the attempt to make vaccination a routine part of primary health care and to integrate it with what was just coming into play as global primary healthcare systems. So this was also the kind of period of Alma Ata and primary health for all, and the attempts across the world with varying degrees of effectiveness to set up primary healthcare systems and often tiered health system approaches which had hospitals and then secondary referral centres, but at the base often rural clinics and health centres. The attempt was to integrate vaccination as something routine which would be part of primary healthcare programmes, and particularly mother and child healthcare and the kinds of infant welfare clinics and MCH programmes which were supposed to be delivered at the lowest tier of the health service in many countries. So this was the attempt, and then there was also this kind of mode of delivery, the sort of National Vaccination Day, which were then and is still to the present used as a way, still taking that kind of campaign form to catch up, or in an instance of an epidemic, or twice a year these big posters to encourage everybody to bring their child forward for measles or polio vaccination. So these things happened across the world, and of course they went along with both some rather different images. So now we're seeing not a military campaign, but a kind of connection between responsible parenthood and happiness and health for children. So there's a very different image here. We haven't got the miserable polio-stricken child. We've got the idea of the happy, playing, smiling baby, happy, healthy, because immunised. And also a kind of strong impetus to parents, particularly mothers, a strong gender emphasis here, on bringing a child for vaccination as part of being a responsible mother and a responsible parent. What also went along with these ideas of responsibility were forms of education. And so we see in the posters of this period more information about what the different vaccines are, the dates, the numbers of months, 2 and 4 and 6 months at which you should be bringing your child for each of those programmes. And this poster information about information, education and communication would also go along with sort of talks and education programmes at these infant welfare clinics. So some changes in image and some kind of expectations of vaccination almost becoming a social expectation, a social responsibility, part of being a good parent, with different images, of course, as to the parent who perhaps doesn't take their child, and we'll come on to thinking about that in a little while. The late 1980s was when the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine was introduced. This was rolled out initially in European countries and in America, and still in many developing countries it's not used. It's often still an individual measles immunisation that's given. That's not to do with controversy. It's more to do with where mumps is a problem and where rubella is a problem. But what's interesting from this period again is that there's another sort of imagery which emerges in these ideas of umbrellas and of rainbows. There's this sense almost of an encompassing notion of protection. That is this vaccine in a way a shield? Is it a way of shielding a child and a body and a community from things that might come to it? This is quite an interesting image, given some of the broader cultural shifts in understandings of immunity that were going on at this time. Now, for those of you who get interested in this, there's a rather wonderful book that I think I put on the reading list by Emily Martin called Flexible Bodies. It would be geared towards those of you who are kind of into medical anthropology a little bit, because what she does is to argue that over the period from the 1950s, so that was the early polio days, there was certainly in Euro-American societies, there was a major shift in how immunity was thought about. At the time, the sort of dominant cultural view, and indeed the view in science, sort of permeating into popular culture, was that germs entered bodies through exteriors. And that was what went along with the vulnerability of the skin, with the need to wash a lot, with the way to protect yourself was to be clean, to, as it were, keep your body and keep your skin as a surface that protected you from germs that would come from outside. But over the sort of subsequent decades, there was a sort of interaction between what was being learnt in science about the operation of the immune system and the functioning of these very specialised cells in the body, which would enable cells to react flexibly to almost anything that came into the body in combinations of different kinds of immune system cells. So immunity came to be understood as a bodily system for fighting disease, and also one that was flexibly specialised. So these cells could combine and recombine in different ways. They could pick up on a particular antigen and create a kind of lock-on effect to fight that particular disease. So not that idea that goes with the military metaphors of a body surface that sort of has to resist attack from outside, but an immune system that could fight from within. So these were powerful ideas in science, but what Martin does is to argue that they also fitted with some broader ideas in popular culture. At a time when industry was changing towards thinking about flexible specialisation in production, towards people's ideas of their lifestyles were changing towards much more individualised models of how people engaged in the world and wanted to do things. So it kind of went along with almost neoliberal ideas about the individual body and the ways they operate in the world. And so this notion of immunity and also affected how people thought about vaccinations. Some of that thinking is part of parental thinking even today, that vaccinations act on their individual child's body in a way that might vary according to what that body is like and towards other bodily experiences that might have happened earlier. But this different idea of immunity and protection is to some extent encompassed in these posters. So what did this all add up to? Well, this is a set of figures from a little while ago now, but the situation has not changed unduly. The effects of the first sort of 30 years of that EPI programme, that big global rollout, were quite dramatic. I mean, if this is the early 1980s, what we saw from that period up to 2006 was an enormous growth. I mean, OK, coverage had already been quite high in some industrialised countries and in Europe. But we saw enormous growth across sub-Saharan Africa, across South Asia, across the Pacific, across the Middle East, and indeed a big increase in industrialised countries, to the point where globally average coverage was about 79% in 2006. Some variation, but basically pretty high. OK, so we've got something that looks quite a lot like a success story. But I want for us to think rather harder about this gap, because filling that gap has been a persistent challenge ever since. We've seen almost these curves have flattened out to some degree, and it's proved really, really hard to increase coverage, and yet it's often, for some of these key antigens, particularly for measles, that bit that really matters, because that's what creates herd immunity in a population. and is actually important for wiping out a disease so that it no longer transmits. So we'll think a bit more about that gap. What happened around the polio story, which had continued through the EPI programme and also through these kind of polio campaigns? Well, polio also became part of a big eradication initiative which was established in the late 1980s. And by this 2006 point, it had been, at one level, pretty effective. So if this is where polio was endemic and a serious problem in 1988 when the eradication initiative started, by 2006 it had been wiped out in most places. But interestingly, some really important pockets remained. One was Nigeria, and the other was really South Asia, so India and Pakistan. And we'll be thinking about the reasons for that, which are quite complicated, and a kind of cultural and political rollout later. But this has gone on being, as it were, frustrating. So whereas in routine vaccination we've got a problem of a 20% gap, with polio there's been the problem that it's actually proved really, really, really hard to get rid of it altogether, and despite enormous international effort. So this has been the challenge over the last 20 years, completing this polio eradication campaign in these outstanding pockets, Nigeria and parts of South Asia. And these are posters which are about vaccination days, so these are not about the routine incorporation into primary health care. It's about having these big rounds which call people together and put a lot of resources and have vaccinators going out door to door and try and bring people into public places to have their children vaccinated, and also meeting that 20% gaps.